Folks, we are live with David Griscom as always, and historian Professor Harvey J.K., Professor Emeritus Harvey J.K. Harvey, welcome for your first appearance on Left Reckoning, I believe.
Yes, and I want everyone to know, if they're not already, they should sign up as Patreons. I did right away as soon as David let me know that they were going to launch this. And I'll tell you guys, every time I'd go to New York and be on the show with Michael, and I was looking at these two guys, in any break, I would turn to Michael and I would say, "Where'd you find these guys? These guys are brilliant." I actually felt almost ignorant next to them. The one guy had a literature podcast show. The other guy was both a philosopher and an economist. I mean, you guys always just blew me away. I felt, boy, oh boy, what did I walk into here? But I also will tell you that I was never, as you know, a fan of Althusser, and I know you were doing that. So
that's true. We always really enjoyed having you in, and your knowledge of history, and also Marxism as well was really a real treat. And you're fun too. That's a rare thing. A lot of people who know these kind of things, they're not a lot of fun to talk to and hang out with.
Well, I remember one time Barbara Ehrenreich wrote a piece. This is before you guys could read probably, but she wrote this piece and she said, if the left and socialism aren't going to be fun, we're never going to win.
That's very true.
Exactly. Yeah. There you go. That's the secret TMBS metric that we had in the grading of our guests. That if you weren't crossing that one, yeah.
Thanks,
Harvey. Joe Biden crossed 200 days. Has he achieved FDR level greatness like some people promised us?
Well, let's start off with the number 200. Okay, start off there. Now, we should probably sidebar this and say, look, yes, we know that the Democrats have a slim margin in the House, okay? And they, if you count it, they don't really have a majority in the Senate, because it's not just Manchin and Sinema, it's also decidedly that whole core of corporate Dems, including the two senators from Delaware. The guy who most antagonizes me is Chris Coons.
Yep.
And in fact, if I can just say, he especially antagonizes me and also reminds me of how often inadequate, I'll forget anything else, just plain inadequate Biden has been, because I'm sure Biden mentored Chris Coons. Yeah. And if Chris Coons he voted no how could anyone? I mean, I thought the Republicans would have been smart if they voted for the 15, because then they would have guaranteed 2022 victory for themselves. I mean, it's so blatantly bizarre and sick that the minimum wage is as low as it is, $7.25, $7.50 at best. And, so anyhow, so you look at the Democrat, let's remember the Democrats themselves as a party. I mean, you heard me go over this over and over again all these years. They've just been so inadequate. They just turned their back on the FDR tradition. And frankly, I mean, if we could for a moment forget LBJ and Vietnam, then they turned their back on the LBJ vision. The Great Society, as inadequate as it was compared, say, to the New Deal, was really in many ways at least a revival of the New Deal. And we would be lucky to have a Great Society set of initiatives right now. So look, FDR became famous for the 100 days, okay? The 100 days. Oh, and I should also say, in defense of FDR, that he didn't have the kind of Democratic Party that he would have liked. He had the Southern Democrats to contend with, the white supremacists, okay? I mean, African Americans in the South, if they could have voted, they would have voted en masse for FDR after the first couple of years of the New Deal, and they became solidly Democratic ever after, you might say. But it's the case that he had to deal with white supremacists in the South who were more than happy for dollars to flow into the South, as long as the dollars didn't dictate any kind of integration or denial of the power of Jim Crow. So, we'll keep that in mind. So FDR, I mean, I can assure you that the New Deal would have been all the more, it was radical enough. Ben Burgess and I can go at this sometime, but the fact is, I mean, the New Deal years were radical years. They were, in context of American history, I'd go so far as to say they were revolutionary, but they could have been truly revolutionary had it not been for those white supremacists who controlled congressional committees in the House and the Senate, because, the South was a one-party regime. And once you were elected in the South, you were there for life. So in essence, since seniority determined chairmanship of committees, you can imagine, and I say chairmanship because they were all men, but okay. So, FDR had to contend with that. Well, Biden, we're post-civil rights. I know civil rights and voting rights are under terrible siege, but it is the case. We are far beyond the kind of white supremacy, segregation, Jim Crow of the 30s. And so if we think about it, Biden should have been able to wield, his leadership should have mattered to the Democrats. And he should have been able to not only do an American Rescue Plan, but an American Rescue Plan that included, $15 minimum wage. How many years have working people been fighting for that, especially poor working people? And that, sorry, Matt, if I'm going on a bit, don't just go give me the timeout kind of thing. Okay?
Yeah, I think I just want to jump in. Like that's the key problem is the Chris Coons thing. Like we have all this focus on Manchin and Sinema. Just the imagining how FDR would deal with sort of elements like that in his party. It wouldn't be to get his sort of proxy in Chris Coons to give them cover as well, which I think is clearly what's going on. I think like the way Jeff Flake was sort of a guy who soaked up never Trump animus during the Trump administration. I think Manchin and Sinema are sort of the same thing.
Yes. Oh, that's a good example, in fact. And in fact, I'll come back to LBJ. It's not that I was 15, I think, when he first ran in 64. But the thing about LBJ is he really knew, physically knew how to twist arms.
Yeah.
And Biden, the only time any of us ever saw Biden get agitated was when he was sort of haranguing his fellow Democrats to cut into Social Security and Medicare. And I actually said to people, one time I was in a conversation with John Nichols from The Nation. We've been friends a long time. This was an off-the-record conversation, but I'll say right now, I would say to him, I think maybe we're underestimating Biden. Maybe that same energy that led him to be so antagonistic to entitlements, right, might lead him to become a leader. But frankly, I don't know if it's the age thing. And whatever else might be happening to his body, but he's just not dynamic. And Harris, look, people can say what they want. Harris is just inadequate altogether. There's just no question.
She's a good fundraiser, which is why they brought her in.
Right.
Yeah.
But I wanted just specifically on the FDR comparison, because it was one thing, in the early days of this show, we've been sort of pushing back against that narrative. Because one, it's not true, and two, it's been really interesting to see how Biden does govern in terms of his public persona in the media. Matt and I have kicked around this term from he's the press release president, right? Where he'll put out this release, right, and he'll be like, we're going to do all this, and we're going to address racial inequities in this country, and we're going to fight for working people, right? But it's a press release, right? And it's geared for people in Politico and Vox to write, how great this great thing is, even though he's not doing it. And two, just specifically on the FDR question, I just would like to hear your perspective on this. The parliamentarian kind of drama that we get from Biden and the constitutional scholar stuff, right? Where it's whenever he wants to do something, it's always we had to ask this secret group of constitutional scholars if we can do it or not. And then also we can never deal with the parliamentarian. I can't imagine, comparing somebody to FDR who just would not immediately take up the cause of whatever progressive things he was trying to push through Congress and leave it as, the parliamentarian blocked it.
Have nothing to fear, but
and they say we can't do
the parliamentarian. By the way,
and that also then it compels me to call attention to the fact that FDR, look, another reason I say the Democrats are so inadequate is that there was a great senator from New York that FDR really depended upon, as in fact, he was called the pilot of the New Deal. And that was Robert Wagner, Robert Wagner Sr., who was as a boy was a German immigrant to the United States. And he was solidly social democratic. Absolutely. And FDR would have been all the more publicly, I believe, a social democrat. I have little doubt about it. But again, he had to contend with the kinds of Southern Democrats he had. But the thing is about that with FDR is this. He knew how to go on radio and speak directly to the American people. And the fundamental thing about that, and this is something I don't think liberals are ever willing to admit this. And the left hesitates to admit it because they don't want to embrace FDR too much. And it's that FDR wanted to rally the troops, you might say. He wanted to speak to Americans because he wanted them to raise hell. Mm-hmm. Okay. And in fact, as one I think it was North Carolina textile worker wrote to FDR, and he said, you're my guy because you know my boss is a son of a bitch, you know? I mean, because FDR, you know, he said, I welcome the hatred of the capitalists, basically. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing is that this is something that I know we're in the age of COVID and all that, but when FDR in 1935 saw the antagonisms emerging amongst capitalists who really hated it, okay, mm-hmm. What he not only took to the radio, gave some of the most radical speeches ever given by an American president, he told his cabinet to go out and mm-hmm. get people to organize, including, I mean, it's very clear about it. He wanted women to organize in consumer movements. And I don't mean like, you know, like the Consumer Reports type stuff. I'm talking about the kind of on the ground movement that could literally combat price rises. Mm-hmm. Okay. And as a consequence, in 1935, 36 and beyond, there began what the Nation magazine at the time called the very first national women's movement since suffrage. And that was the housewives movement, which was the idea they were going to organize alongside labor versus capital. Mm-hmm. And this was FDR's idea of how you create a presidency. I can say it here amongst fellow people, you know, Marxists, is the idea. He wanted that dialectic between people and president. That to him was what a democratic presidency had to be about.
Yeah, and I mean the thing is, it's hard sometimes to talk about Biden and his strategy because it's just clear he doesn't think in the same way, or I don't even think particularly wants to do a lot of these things. But one example to me that was so frustrating to me even early on in the Biden administration and when these comparisons were being made was, you know, these checks that came out under Trump and under Biden. Those are some of the most popular programs that the federal government has done, probably in my lifetime. People love
definitely in your lifetime.
You know, people love those, and because it really helped them out. And you know, one thing I've been telling people, there's a really great piece that I was actually revisiting lately by Mike Davis in New Left Review called "Trench Warfare," which was sort of looking at the data of the 2020 election. And you know, one of the big things here that I've been paying attention in Texas was what happened with the Biden coalition. What was the Biden coalition in Texas, right? And the frightening thing about the Biden coalition, right, is that he starts to lose. Trump eats into the black vote and the Hispanic vote in ways that are, you know, just they can boggle your mind. But when you sent people in to talk to people in those communities, do you know what folks said? Donald Trump sent me a check for $1,200, and I really appreciated that. And you know, and it's like we can, you know, squabble about how true all that kind of stuff is, but you know what? If Biden was out there every day saying, this is my thing, this is what we're doing, and we're going to do a lot more of it, I just couldn't imagine it even being close. And then as president now, you see him sort of sprinting away from all of these programs that, again, are extremely popular.
Well, first of all, I want to say you're being very kind to say that he can sprint anywhere. Okay, that's for a start, physically. But more significantly is the fact that I don't even think they understand that. Look, remember there was the $600 check that finished off the Trump presidency, and they kept talking about a $2,000 check, and then they said they reduced it to $1,400. Well, why? Because they already gave us $600. We don't have to fulfill the $2,000. It's like, couldn't they figure out that the first thing that people would say is, "Wait a minute, where's the other 600 or whatever it's supposed to be," you know?
Like, here's the New Democrats welcome a technicality that means you get $600 less than you thought. Like,
yeah, well, so, okay. I mean, then if we think about another thing about Biden is this, the fact is that he could possibly redeem a little bit of FDR. He could possibly, because I don't want to, it's so easy to knock Biden, and it's fun to do it, really. But it's also the case that, is there any way to redeem the moment? And there is a way. This is a long shot, given we're talking Joe Biden. So let's imagine that the Democrats actually do what they keep promising to do. That is, they literally in tandem enact I hate to even call it a bipartisan infrastructure bill, but it's there. Mm-hmm. And the other $33.5 trillion infrastructure, yep. Right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So let's suppose they get those things through. Now, as a sidebar to that, and I know we only have so much time, I do want to say, to go back to I think it was Matt, or one of you said it, is the fact that Biden says one thing and at the same time he does something else. And not too many weeks ago, everyone was talking about the antitrust moment. We were going to see the breakup of the big corporate trusts. Presumably that would mean ag trusts and big tech trusts. Okay. Or I'm using the old term trusts. But they appointed Lena Khan to head the Federal Trade Commission, and a man whose name I constantly blow because he has a name not unlike one of my students, but they named an assistant attorney general, a guy who was clearly an antitrust advocate. Okay. Mm-hmm. But here, the bill that has come together that Biden is so ready to sign, there are loopholes in that, which would literally entitle the likes of Comcast and other, sort of telecom companies not to be the ones who literally go into the rural areas for the broadband access, to lay out. Now, all they'll do literally is offer yet another multi-billion-dollar gift to these big, corporations. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I wish the right hand would talk to the left hand. It's not an administration that's strikingly clever. Let me put it that way. But let's come back. Let's suppose they pass those two things. Now, on their own, they're great and yet inadequate. I mean, the Green New Deal has been marginalized in too many ways. We could go on and on. But here's the thing. You and I, we all know, the three of us know, that the $15 minimum wage, if that doesn't happen, this administration will be remembered for failing the working poor. Okay. Mm-hmm. It's also the case that they've literally, have you heard anything about expanding healthcare? No. Okay. Have you heard anything? Let me back off what I'm about to say.
There's some Medicare expansion, wasn't there, in the
some floated, yeah.
Yes, there is. Yeah, there is, and also there are some elements I understand of the PRO Act, the workers' rights bill.
The PRO Act would be magnificent,
and it's parts of the PRO Act, right?
But
but here's what Biden could do to show he actually knows what it might be like to be more like FDR. Okay, and it's this. Let's suppose they pass that. Well, I'm sure there are plenty of pens on the executive desk, right? The president. You ought to pick them up and start signing 3 executive orders, right? The first executive order is any worker who's working for some company that receives federal dollars for the infrastructure labors must be guaranteed health care. Mm-hmm. That's the first. The second is anybody working in the infrastructure budget terms will be guaranteed with his or her fellow workers the right to organize and collective bargaining, undeterred by the company for which they work. Okay. And the third one would be, let's see, we mentioned healthcare, $15. I blanked on the third. Did I mention 3?
Was it $15? I think.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It must be paid a minimum of $15. Right. Yeah. So there's your 3 executive orders. They could do it as one grand executive order. Call it the Democratic executive order, whatever it is. Now, it's important. Admittedly, if the Republicans should win next time around, they could always rescind those things. But I can tell you, if you've got millions of workers who are getting $15 an hour, and all of a sudden some Republican says he's going to lift that, I could tell you, maybe finally you'll see workers in the streets.
Yeah, make them do it. Make them pay that price. Right. And in the meantime, you get paid more and get a union.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and at least you have the union then, right? Okay. So the thing is that would be a way to start building on this infrastructure plan. But by the way, to go back to Matt's 200 days, it should have been done in 100 days, because if you don't get the work underway, if you don't get people employed, if you don't get them engaged, especially with these executive orders empowering them, people aren't going to even appreciate this stuff. And they'll go into 2022. Look, I don't think people are going to shift and vote for Republicans. I'm more worried they just ain't going to vote.
I'm worried.
I think that they are, honestly. I mean, I think that a lot of working people won't vote because that's been the trend. I think a lot of the gains that were critical for Biden will evaporate pretty quickly because a lot of the people who were critical for Biden's win, I don't want to give too much like horse race stuff, but like a lot of people who were critical for Biden's win were these, kind of upper middle class white suburban voters who typically trend Republican, right? But there was a kind of revolt against Donald Trump, rightfully so. And I don't know, sometimes I wonder if Biden is playing more to that class of people than what you would expect his traditional base being, working people and people of color, right? I see a lot more of this, of the way that he's trying to sell his presidency, not necessarily to like working people as much as like to that kind of class of folks. And at the end of the day, the amount of stuff that he's bungled is not really going to sit well with those people either, right? Because they're just a kind of credentialed class too. They like things to be.
Well, that's true. Scams. Well, yeah. I mean, it's hard to argue with that right now because because I do think you're right about Biden, who he's playing to.
Yeah.
Okay. That I do believe, but I think it's also the case that I'm not convinced that the more Trump opens his mouth, the greater the chance he won't lose those folks.
Yeah, I think it's not a foregone conclusion that the Democrats can't win with a suburban strategy in continuance. And we keep these very slim margins. Like they also did the child care allowance benefits too, and that's also going to be good in the suburbs. Like they can maybe do just enough to squeak by with the type of electorate that doesn't put more pressure on them than they don't want.
But I will also tell you, to go back now to the FDR example, is FDR didn't say to himself, well, if we get these things through, we're going to be in good shape. What he said actually was, new laws in themselves do not bring the new millennium. What he meant by that is you're going to have to be ready to fight. Okay. And right now, it's like everybody in the labor movement is like there are people out on strike, but I haven't heard Biden come out again and saying, hey, there are Nabisco workers on strike. There are nurses in any number of places on strike. I mean,
look, where's Biden right now coming up for the folks in at Warrior Met in Alabama, right? In a red state, coming up and saying, hey, this big firm that came and bought out this company when they were in trouble, right? And is now screwing the workers once they become profitable again. Why is Biden not up there right now, standing up with those people very vocally, right? And even on a completely cynical move, right, to just hit the Republicans and this kind of right-wing push, because I know you're very adamant and are worried about this kind of like populist right-wing veneer that some of these new Republicans are doing. Like, we stand up for the workers against these kind of corporate Democrats, right? Squash that right away.
I mean, that's what you've got a cabinet for. Send Walsh down. Okay. Send anyone you can out of the cabinet who might have some kind of connection to labor, and do it. Okay. You've got to show solidarity for people to show solidarity with you. I mean,
I mean, that's the thing is, like, we might get parts of the PRO Act in this bill, but it's also like, if you had control of your party, you could just pass that thing and we could, right. And we wouldn't have to worry about like what the parliamentarian's going to say about the penalties to employers.
Yes, and by the way, obviously we haven't even mentioned the filibuster question, but listen, we don't need to go there. But regarding that Senate, that what are they called? The secretary? What is it called? The
Senate parliamentarian.
Senate parliamentarian, right? First of all, it was to FDR's advantage that he never served in the Congress. He was a state senator and a governor of New York, and he served in the cabinet under Wilson as a sub-cabinet member. And so, in essence, he had more experience as an executive, as a governor, and so he learned to work with people in Congress. Whereas Biden thinks he knows Congress, okay, and thinks somehow if he dances properly, things will work out. Well, that's bullshit. We know that. We've already seen it. It started with the $15, assuming it's even hard to believe Biden didn't want the $15. It's just impossible to believe he didn't want that. That was a sign of his inadequacy to me.
Yeah, it's a weird. I mean, it's a weird moment, and I just want to catch myself too when we're talking about Biden and the Biden administration. I'm just speaking for myself here. It's like, trying to understand these plays and what they're doing is less so for me giving free advice to Biden and the Democrats, and more trying to understand the stage and the moment that we're in, right? Because like at the end of the day, it's like the reality is that they're answering to their people, and they're doing. They're doing the favors for the folks who get.
They're answering to the National Restaurant Association.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, yes, they are, and I want to back off and say I actually have no idea whether Biden would really want the $15 an hour or not.
I think, can I just say real quick? I think he would like it in a case where we're not in the middle of maybe a pandemic and the economy was just booming in a real way. But I think in a moment like we're in now, I think that's also why he's not in a hurry to do anything about student loans. It's like we need to basically crack the whip and get people back to work, and then we can start giving away more goodies, I think.
Well, and there he's utterly different than FDR as well, because FDR believed, not just for the sake of the politics of it, but he actually believed if you want to get your economy moving and dynamic, okay, give people money to spend and make it happen as quickly as you can. The other thing I was going to say, to maybe connect to something really important to all of us, is that so much of this is I've said this a number of times in the last few weeks, and that is that the left will always be up against the wall until the labor movement. And what we're seeing in these strikes is the beginnings of worker agitation. And somehow, and I'm going to say this, somehow your show and other shows, and I have little doubt of your desire to do so, and I know the kinds of people you've had on, the more we can become the vehicle for the working class to recognize itself. We're going to be the better off we're going to be. Okay, there is no future for the left unless there's a future for a dynamic labor movement.
Yeah, and it's like I sort of have to paraphrase it because I don't have the direct quote, but it's one of those things like somebody who we've been influenced a lot by is like Leo Panitch, right?
Oh, sure, yeah, I knew Leo well for years.
Yeah, an incredible human being and a theorist and a thinker. And he pushes back against some of the kind of doomerism, right? Which might be a little bit of an online term, but that, a lot of people on the left have, especially around climate, right? Which is like, obviously things are really bad. But if you want to build this movement, if you want to win and take power and do good and help out your community and help out society, we can't lose the ability to be able to think 2 years, 5 years, 10 years down the line. Because then we'll always be on this kind of backseat. Because when we're sitting here right now, we saw this incredible moment with Bernie Sanders that really mobilized a hell of a lot of people, and a lot of people started to believe that politics could change their lives for the better, which is not something that many people think. But then, in the absence of Bernie, we're in this kind of a loss, right? And without a structure, we don't have the ability to organize ourselves to move in a collective, right? So you get a lot of people who do like media strategies, for example, right? Like, oh, if only we frame this argument a certain way, things are going to change, right? And essentially what you're arguing for is like, we just need to find a better way to beg, right? And the only, and it's like, that's, I mean, it can work sometimes, right? It can be helpful if we can create the right case. But what's a lot more powerful is being able to say like, no, we have power and you need to answer to us. And as you were saying, and, as we say on this show all the time, it has to come through labor and it has to come through the working class understanding itself as that class. And I think getting people to start to recognize that, and even though it's a hard realization that like, man, it was nice when we thought we were really close to state power with Bernie Sanders, but being able to look in the mirror, understanding where we are, not in a defeatist way, but not falling into these kind of fantasies that I think some people on the left have fallen into recently is really important. And also thinking constructively about what could somebody like Biden be doing? Like, what would state power be looking like in this moment is really helpful as well, too.
Yeah. I mean, look, I twice I fell into the dream mode that Bernie could win. Okay. It's funny. The first time, just for the record, the first time around, it came as such an amazing surprise. You guys may recall, I'm sure I said it back on TMBS, that must have told Michael, I was with Bernie from the 80s. I used to say, God, do you think one day I can vote for someone like that in Wisconsin? And I got to vote for him in the primary for president. And I thought it was just great. And I really thought it might be possible to break the Clinton machine. And I can tell you that the American people wanted it. They wanted that Clinton machine broken, and Bernie would have beaten Trump. I don't give a shit what anyone says otherwise.
For sure.
Yeah.
He definitely would have beaten Trump in 2016. And then, because keep in mind the states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, I could tell you that without doubt he would have won these 3 states. So, but then in 2020, I was not so confident mostly because there were just so many Democrats, especially when you got the likes of Harris saying do you remember Harris saying she embraced Medicare for all when she first started?
They all did in some form, right?
So classic. But then I also have to say that I really thought that I had no idea they would gang up on him so effectively. But more important than that is that Bernie didn't know how to punch back. And that was the shame of it. And of course, the problem we have right now is we've got, young leftists and progressives like your ages, and we've got this older guy, Bernie Sanders, who, his health is going to be, troubled. We know that. And I just think, what do we do about the middle there? Okay. Yeah. Or am I wrong? Maybe young people, maybe they do like older folks, as long as we're on the right side, the left side of the political spectrum. So.
Well, I mean, I think,
I'm not announcing a candidacy. I just want you.
No, I mean, I'm sure that, honestly, I think that, thinking about politics too much by age can be really unhelpful. I think people fall into that trap a little too often. No, but I think
one thing we should remind everyone who's listening, especially since you're in Texas and you are a Texan, and I always loved you for that. In fact, I'll tell everyone how many times I used to send you side notes about the fact I don't think there was some guest on, maybe Jim yesterday, I don't think they understand the South, is what I would say. But, once upon a time, Texas was a stronghold of socialist politics, not just populist, but socialist politics. So.
No, I mean, that's their history. And I mean, maybe this might be a good kind of segue to talk a little bit of Paine, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this too. The Texas history with socialists is incredible. Our friend Megan Day at Jacobin has been writing these really great pieces. She did a piece on Commonwealth College in Northwest Arkansas, which was a kind of radical socialist college in rural Arkansas in the early 20th century. And she just wrote a pretty interesting piece about the Green Corn Rebellion in Oklahoma, right?
Oh, I gotta read that. Yeah,
and it's really critical, I think, to actually be able to orient yourself in these kind of historical struggles. In politics, to not treat ideas like socialism, social democracy, and Marxism as these inherently foreign ideologies, and actually, realize no, man, your grandfathers or your great grandfathers or whatever, they were radicals. If you're from these kind of communities, and because in Texas, it's a great example of this too. It's people have just sort of accepted that, for example, it's a red state, and that's always what it has been. It's no, man, that's not true at all. This was had a very different.
And if I remember correctly, Matt, you're from North Dakota.
I am. That's correct. Yeah.
I don't want to empower Texas in this conversation over North Dakota. The left politics historically in North Dakota was an example for farm labor movements. In fact, I assume it's still there, but the only state in the country that actually created a state bank in order to avoid the capitalist banks was North Dakota.
That state bank, the Bank of North Dakota, is what paid for me to go to London and for summer school back in 2011, and gave me a nice good loan, and I got to enjoy a lot of London thanks to that loan. So I appreciate it.
And I want everyone else out there to know that Wisconsin was the capital P progressive state in the early part of the century, and the city of Milwaukee, which I do not live in, I'm 120 miles north, for much of the 20th century was run by socialist mayors. So I'm not saying we should worship all of that. I think the fact is that it ought to be a reminder that East and West Coast folks, we're not just flyover country,
Yeah. No, I didn't know. I mean, I think it is it's sort of spiritually nourishing too, to find out. I was reading Hammer and Hoe by Robert G. Kelly, and I didn't know Bismarck was the Peasant International for the Soviets, in the 20s. So I have no idea that we don't have a monument to that. You could be surprised.
That's why they placed all those missile silos in North Dakota.
Right, exactly.